The Lost Heir of Glenmoor. The Lost Heir of Glenmoor. The storm came shrieking down from the western mountains as though the sky itself had cracked. Wind scoured the heather, driving the rain sideways in silver spears. Peat smoke vanished, and the sheep huddled against the stones for want of mercy. Out on the open moor, a lone lantern bobbed, no star, but the stubborn defiance of a woman named Finlay Kincaid. She leaned into the gale, shawl pulled over her head, calling to her husband who trudged a few paces ahead. Ian's voice was a growl against the wind. "We'll lose the ewe if she's gone far, woman. The lamb will freeze." But even as he spoke, another sound tore across the night, thin, human, desperate. Not a lamb at all, but the high, broken cry of a child. Mary stopped. The wind filled her silence with rain. Then she ran. Behind a tangle of gorse, she found the source of that cry, a small bundle half buried in heather, its woolen wrap soaked through, its occupant pale as milk. The lantern's light wavered over the tiny face, over a glint of metal pinned to the cloth, a silver brooch, engraved with a stag rampant. "Sweet heaven," she breathed, "who would leave a babe on a night like this?" She gathered him into her arms. The child's body was cold, the breath faint but present. Ian crouched beside her, rain dripping from his beard. "He'll not live long out here. We've to bring him home." And so they did, through sleet and wind, across the soaked ground, their boots squelching in the mud. When they reached the croft, the hearth was a salvation. Ian fed the fire until it blazed. Mary stripped the wet blanket and wrapped the child in one of her own shawls. Before dawn, the tiny fists opened, and the faintest sigh came from his lips. Mary smiled through tears she would never admit to. "Finlay," she whispered, "for my father's name. And if the Lord has other plans, he'll need to argue with me first." The silver brooch she hid between the pages of her family Bible, an unspoken secret shining faintly through the paper whenever she turned to Psalms. A boy of the hills. Finlay Kincaid grew as the Highlands grow, slowly, stubbornly, beautifully. By the time he could walk, he already knew the voice of the wind and the temper of sheep. Mary taught him kindness as a habit. Ian taught him that work was a man's best sermon. Between them they raised a boy, both gentle and unbending. He was different, though none could quite say why. Even as a child he carried himself with the stillness of someone listening to a tune only he could hear. By 16, he was tall, steady-eyed, and a better hand with a crook than men twice his age. The villagers liked him, trusted him, but whispered sometimes when his back was turned. "He's not truly theirs," they murmured. "Found on the moor, wasn't he?" But whenever such talk reached Mary, she would tighten her shawl and answer, "Blood is the least of what makes a man." One spring evening, as daylight stretched long across the hills, she brought out the Bible that had guarded the secret 18 years. The brooch lay where she'd left it, its silver dulled but proud. "This was pinned to you the night you came to us," she said. "It may one day answer questions. I cannot. Keep it, Finlay, but keep your wits sharper still." He turned the brooch in his fingers, tracing the stag's horns. "It's a fine thing," he said, half smiling, "but I'll take it as a reminder of you, not of whoever lost me." Yet that night, before sleep claimed him, he found himself staring at the little emblem in the candle's glow, wondering what kind of hands had once fastened it to his blanket, and why they'd let him go. Departure. When his 19th year came, work grew scarce. The croft needed coin more than sentiment, and so Finn, as everyone called him, set out for Inverness to find labour as a drover. He kissed Mary's cheek, clasped Ian's hand, and walked down the valley road at dawn, the brooch tied beneath his shirt. Behind him the smoke from the croft rose straight into a sky washed clean by night's rain. He thought little of destiny, only of distance and wages. But destiny, it seems, had already made its plans. the house on the hill. High above the glen stood Glenmoor Castle, home of Laird Duncan MacLeod and his lady Isabel. Its turrets caught the sun like weathered crowns. Its walls had seen war and wedding alike. Within those walls lived a grief no banner could hide. 2 decades earlier, Duncan had been told that his infant son had died at birth. The word had come from his brother Malcolm, charming, learned, ambitious, and sealed by a friar's record. Isabel had never believed it. She prayed, she searched, she waited, but no rider ever brought news, and hope hardened into habit. Malcolm prospered, Duncan aged, and far away, on a croft the castle never noticed, the lost child grew into a man. The meeting in Inverness. In the bustle of the Inverness market, Finn found his first test. He had just sold a load of wool when he heard a woman cry out in the alley behind the stalls. 3 rough men had cornered her. Young, flame-haired, a basket of books spilled at her feet. Finn acted without thought. A shove, a swing of his staff, and 2 were down. The 3rd fled into the rain. The woman gathered her scattered volumes, astonishment and gratitude mingling in her face. "Thank you," she said. "My father will never send me with the takings again." Finn only nodded, brushing dirt from his coat. In that moment, a tall man, grey at the temples, stepped from the crowd. He wore the bearing of someone accustomed to command, the steward Seamus of Glenmoor. "Lad," said Seamus, eyes fixed on the bit of silver chain peeking from Finn's collar, "where did you get that brooch?" "It was found with me," Finn answered. "Belonged to no one else I know." Seamus's face changed, hope struggling with disbelief. "Come with me," he said quietly. "There's a family that may wish to look upon you." And before Finn quite understood it, he was riding behind the steward toward the castle that had haunted the edge of every Highlander's skyline. The Hall of Antlers. The hall of Glenmoor smelled of peat smoke and thyme. Antlers crowned the laird's chair, trophies of generations long buried. When Finn entered, Lady Isabel rose from her seat. Her face went white, then flooded with colour. She saw in him the shape of her husband's youth and the echo of the child she had lost. Duncan himself, gaunt and proud, gripped the arms of his chair. "Who brings this man?" he demanded. "I do," said Seamus. "He bears the stag of Glenmoor." Malcolm MacLeod, standing by the fire, smiled with perfect ease. "A curious coincidence," he murmured. "Such trinkets are easily forged." Finn unclasped the brooch and set it on the table. "If it's false, call it so. I only ask truth." Isabel's hands shook as she lifted it. The small nick on its rim, the one she had made herself years ago when careless youth met silver, was still there. Her breath left her in a sound halfway between sob and prayer. "It is ours," she said. "It has waited for us." Malcolm's expression flickered. Only once, but enough. That night Brother Padrig, summoned from his monastery, came trembling into the hall. In front of the laird, the lady and the steward, he confessed the lie that had gnawed his conscience for 20 years. "The child lived," he said. "For gold, I wrote otherwise." Duncan turned to Finn and laid a hand upon his shoulder. "Then you are my son," he said simply. "Welcome home." Outside the wind shifted, spring smelled suddenly nearer. Installment 2. Flight, mercy, and the return of evil. The castle did not sleep the night the truth returned to it. Servants moved softly, as if afraid to jar the miracle, and the peat fires burned lower, cautious of their own crackle. In a quiet chamber, Lady Isabel sat with folded hands and watched her son breathe by candlelight, as if to memorize the rise and fall, to be sure it would not vanish with the dawn. Someone else did not sleep. Near midnight, a postern door eased open, and a cloaked figure slipped into the drizzle. The figure moved quickly across the yard to the stables, a shadow among shadows. A horse snorted, soothed by a practiced hand. Hooves were muffled with cloth. A hinge, freshly oiled, did not complain. By the time the eastern sky paled, Malcolm MacLeod had gone. Seamus found the guard slumped by the door, drugged rather than beaten. On Malcolm's table a coffer stood ajar, its lining showing where jewels had been plucked. A single curl of sealing wax lay on the floor, crimson, with the faintest impression of the stag. Malcolm, even in flight, could not resist the emblem he had tried to steal. Duncan received the news with a long breath that had the weight of years in it, not hours. "Then we finish what honesty began," he said. "Saddle at once." Finn was already in the yard, buckling a strap with hands that refused to shake. He felt no triumph, no fear, only the sure pull of a task that had chosen him. Seamus swung into the saddle beside him, and the two rode out ahead of the company, the steward's knowledge of the land knitting with Finn's instinct for it. They took the west slope where bog and rock make sullen neighbours. Hoofprints stitched a dark thread across the heather. A snapped twig told of haste. The clean cut of iron in turf marked a rider who believed himself too clever to be caught. The wind had turned cold enough to sting, but not cold enough to clear. The kind of weather that keeps secrets only until someone asks the right question. Close to noon they saw smoke. A low shieling roof, half fallen, sagged against the hillside, its stones old as stubbornness. Finn raised a hand. The company dismounted in silence. Malcolm sat by the embers with his cloak about him, eyes bright and unreadable. Two hirelings snored near the wall, men bought with coin, and now discovering that coin is poor bedding. Malcolm lifted his head, amused that the inevitable had arrived on time. "Nephew," he said mildly, as if greeting a late guest to dinner, or usurper. "We have not settled the vocabulary." "Nor the bill," Finn answered. There was no grand speech. Seamus gave a nod. The hirelings, roused, confused, reached for blades, and found instead the heavy clarity of 6 Glenmoor men stepping between them and foolishness. Malcolm stood, very calm, and drew steel. He fought like a man who had memorized himself. Every stroke was elegant, each retreat exact. Finn did not match elegance, he matched intention. He shifted a half step at the right time. He let Malcolm spend breath. He allowed the older man to admire his own skill until admiration became a misstep. The end was a small thing, a twist of wrist, a boot against a stone, a blade spinning from fingers too proud to admit they were tired. Malcolm stood unarmed, rain beading on his hair. "Well," he said, and gave a thin smile. A neat reversal. The foundling corrects the blood. Finn's sword hung idle. "Come home," he said. "You'll stand before those you wronged." "You won't hang me," Malcolm murmured. "It would trouble your sleep." "It would trouble the clan more to watch me hate you," Finn said. "I'll not put that work in their eyes." For the first time Malcolm's gaze altered, not softened, but puzzled. He offered his wrists. The rope settled there like a sentence finally spoken aloud. They rode back in rain that made little whispers on cloak and leather. Malcolm kept his poise, head high, as if he had chosen the procession. When the column reached the gate, people came to look, not to jeer. Highlanders do not waste a face with easy mockery. They watched a man unmade by his own making, and a youth who refused to be enlarged by another's fall. Duncan met them in the hall. He did not mount the dais. He stood where any tenant might stand. He looked at his brother and saw, for a heartbeat, the boy who had once raced him along the river's stones. Then he saw what years had carved. "Malcolm MacLeod," he said, voice without tremor. "You will be judged. Not by rage, by us." They gave the traitor a cell and a lamp, and a silence that has undone stronger men. Lady Isabel did not go down. She sent the lamp and the blanket, and a prayer folded small enough to fit in a pocket, if a soul had one left. For a little while, peace came, uneasy but present. The castle learned Finn's step. He rose early, walked the yard, listened more than he spoke. He visited crofts that had only ever seen a laird when taxes were late. He asked after roofs, after wells, after mothers who needed more flour than pride allowed them to request. Mary and Ian came up from the hill one Sabbath, and Finn met them at the gate as any son greets any parents, without show. Mary's hand found his cheek, and she nodded once, satisfied that the house had not made him brittle. Elspeth, the bookseller's daughter, began to appear as if ordinary days had invited her. She brought a basket of worn volumes and the kind of cheer that warms mortar. She and Lady Isabel climbed to the chapel loft with dustcloths and quiet plans. "The glen keeps its stories in mouths," Elspeth said, "and it will go on doing that. Let us add shelves so the stories can go farther when needed." Seamus, meanwhile, kept his ear to the ground and his eyes on ink. He walked the accounts with Finn in a small room where the light was good. "Numbers tell a kind of gossip," he said. "The honest kind, if you insist on it." Finn learned to insist. He also learned the weight of the antlered chair. Duncan made him sit in it some mornings, only a little while, so the hall could grow used to the shape. The old laird sat nearby with a blanket over his knees and told a story about the winter. The river froze, and 3 boys played curling with a wheel of cheese. Laughter returned to the stones, shy like a dog invited in from the threshold. And yet a castle's peace is like a mill pond. The surface is calm because something below is keeping pace. Malcolm kept to his cell, asked for little, spoke almost nothing. He ate enough to live. Sometimes the guard heard him laugh softly, as if at a private jest that improved with repetition. Seamus took no comfort in that quiet. "Silence can be a tool," he said, and doubled the night watch. The first stitch of trouble came not from the dungeon but from the road. A rider brought a letter in the late light of an ordinary day, a letter sealed with Duncan's crest, sent from the lowlands. Seamus cracked the wax and frowned, then carried the message to the laird. It was beautifully written, in a hand that imitated Duncan's own, a shade too perfectly. "Prepare the hall," it said, "for the true son returns." Duncan said nothing. He handed the sheet to Lady Isabel. She read it once, twice. The second time, the paper trembled between her fingers, not from belief, but from anger old and newly sharpened. By week's end, the rumour had run ahead of any horse. Crofters spoke of it under their breath. The smith paused mid-hammer. A merchant swore he had seen the young man in Stirling, a fine coat, an assured posture, a silver brooch shining at his throat. Finn listened, said nothing, and sharpened a quill instead of a blade. He had learned that some fights require paper first. He was in the yard when the stranger arrived. The evening was clean and blue. Birdsong carried farther than usual. Even the dogs seemed to choose courtesy. A party of 3 came up the lane, the foremost a man of 26 or so, handsome in the way that feels curated, just enough stubble to suggest hardship, just enough polish to declare the opposite. He swung down from his horse with elegant ease and bowed to Lady Isabel, who waited on the steps with Duncan's arm in hers. "Mother," he said, and the word hung like a thing stolen. "I have come home." The brooch on his chest caught the light. It was perfect. Too perfect. Finn felt a peculiar sadness. He had met wolves and men. This was something else. A mask offered a name it did not deserve. They brought the stranger, Thomas Drummond he called himself, into the hall. He spoke smoothly of a childhood in hiding, of nurses whose names did not match, of a sudden discovery and a rush of longing that had carried him north. His brooch shone brighter than the fire. He looked at Finn with gentle pity, as if apologizing for the inconvenience of existing. Duncan's face did not change. Lady Isabel's did, only in the eyes, where iron set quietly. Seamus stood at the edge of the company and watched the man's hands. Hands tell you what a story cannot. These hands were careful with rings, careless with rope, clean where a Highland winter leaves clean only the unburdened. The elders were called. Brother Padrig, paler than before but steadier, came at Seamus's request and sat with his rosary between work-stained fingers. Men and women of the glen crowded the edges of the hall, not noisy, not cruel, curious in that Highland way that mixes memory with measure. "Proof," Duncan said, and the word was neither invitation nor threat. "We will have proof." Thomas smiled, just a shade late. "Of course," he answered. "You shall have it. I am it." He held out his brooch. Isabel looked once, set it down and said, "There is a nick on the rim of mine." "Where is yours?" Thomas tilted the piece under the light, hunting for a wound he had never suffered. "Perhaps it's worn smooth," he said pleasantly. "Time is a kind smith." A quiet ripple moved across the floor, like wind against barley. Elspeth stood behind a pillar in the twilight of the side aisle, a basket of mending balanced on her hip. Her eyes moved from Thomas's perfect brooch to Finn's, duller, nicked, honest, and back again. Her mind, accustomed to mending pages, began to stitch. That evening, when the hall had thinned and the stranger had been shown a guest chamber rather than a victory, she climbed to the east wing, where few went. Dust lay peacefully over old books. A shelving board sat loose. Behind it, because old houses keep secrets for those who ask gently, she found a cedar box, its lid stiff from disuse. She carried it to Lady Isabel with both hands. The lid opened on a scent of long-kept lavender. Inside lay letters in Isabel's own script, careful and immediate, written in the days before her marriage. Letters that spoke of Moira Fraser, beloved and hand-fasted to Duncan in Highland rite. Letters that promised protection for the child Moira carried. Letters that ended suddenly, the ink hurried by grief. Beneath the letters, folded as if by a woman in tears, lay a swaddling band. Thistle. Stag stitches remembered by fingers that had taught them. Isabel sat down without meaning to. She pressed the band to her mouth, then to her heart, then into Finn's hands. "This," she whispered, "is the truth that never once left me." Seamus came with the kirk register, with a witness who had poured ale at the handfasting, with a memory that had waited for a place to land. The elders read, and the hall absorbed a new shape. In the morning, Duncan would call the council. In the morning, a polite impostor would be asked harder questions than his smile could defer. In the morning, a house would bind its wound with names that knew how to hold. But that night, as the candles guttered and the stones cooled, the brooch on Finn's chest lay warm against a heart that had learned patience. Some battles rush, some arrive on steady feet. Finn slept, with a rope coiled on a hook, with a ledger open on the table, with the knowledge that Mercy had not emptied his hands for work. Far below, in a cell lit by a single lamp, Malcolm smiled into his blanket. Even absent, he liked to share the stage. Installment 3, Fire, the Ledger, and the Gorge. Morning broke on Glenmoor with thin light and heavy hearts. The impostor Thomas Drummond was gone before sunrise, vanishing down the south road with only shame for baggage. Duncan had him followed as far as the ford, then ordered the matter ended. "The snake's head is gone," he said, "and will waste no prayers on the skin it leaves." But peace was not yet honest. Rumour, once bitten, keeps its teeth. Some whispered that Finn's fortune had been too swiftly found. Others, that Duncan had grown too old to tell one son's face from another's. Finn met every stare with the same calm he had shown since the day he first crossed the castle gate. He worked, he mended, he planned. And that is what the devil waits for. A steady heart, so he can strike it by surprise. The fire at the South Mill. It came on a night without warning. A red bloom rose against the dark like some monstrous flower. The South Mill, pride of Glenmoor, was burning. By the time Finn reached the hill's base, flames licked the rafters, sparks scattered across the river. Men and women ran with buckets, faces wild in the light. Finn waded into the blaze, ordering lines, kicking doors, dragging sacks clear before the roof gave way. When at last the fire drowned itself in its own smoke, nothing remained but the black ribs of timber and the faint hiss of ruin. Seamus found the first clue, a pouch half buried in the ash, its wax seal unbroken. He turned it over, frowning. The seal bore Finn's own crest. Inside lay rags soaked in oil. The crowd's mood shifted like weather. A farmer's voice cracked through the smoke. Who else would carry such a mark? Another added, to burn his own father's grain, God's curse on greed. The muttering thickened, hot as the fire had been. Finn took the pouch, broke the seal before them all, and emptied it onto the ground. Out spilled sheets of paper, his ledgers inked in his own neat hand. Records of seed lent, debts forgiven, grain gifted to widows. If this is my guilt, he said, then it is guilt enough to rebuild the mill twice over. He lifted one page, edges still smoking, and the crowd fell silent. Someone planted kindness in the ashes and called it crime. Seamus stepped beside him, voice carrying over the embers. The man who lights a lie leaves his shadow behind. We'll find it. The hidden book. 2 days later, Elspeth came to the laird's hall, her cloak spattered with rain and her eyes bright with purpose. I think I've found the shadow, she said, and laid a small leather volume on the table. The binding was cracked. The ink inside was the fine, slanting script none could mistake, Malcolm MacLeod's. It was a ledger, not of trade, but of treachery. Entries of payments to Thomas Drummond, names of merchants bribed, letters ordered forged, even the gold spent to hire the men who had set fire to the mill. Each line gleamed like confession in black and red. Finn read in silence until the pages blurred. At last he closed the book and said, He's still reaching from the dark. Duncan touched the cover, his old hand steady. Then we'll answer him in daylight. Call the council to the moor. Let the wind and the people hear what ink alone cannot hold. The moor council. The next morning dawned hard and clear. By the cairns of Rue, men and women gathered from every croft, every valley. The council stone stood in the centre, polished by centuries of argument. Finn laid the ledger upon it and began to read. Name by name, coin by coin, he spoke the record aloud. He spared no one, not gentry, not servant. Each hearing of guilt was answered by the hiss of the wind through heather, and when he finished, the glen itself seemed to breathe easier. Seamus closed the book. The debt is named, he said. Now let the land begin its penance. But Finn's eyes were on the far ridge where the old road twisted toward the sea. I think the penance will find us first, he murmured. For even as he spoke, a messenger came panting up the slope. Lady Isabel was missing. Her horse had been found by the river, reins cut clean, and on the ground near the ford lay a torn scrap of banner cloth, crimson, edged in silver thread. Duncan's face went grey as frost. Malcolm, he said simply. The bridge at Rue Gorge. Night fell before Finn found them. The moon rode low behind clouds, showing more shadow than light. Below, the gorge roared, swollen with spring rain. On the narrow bridge stood Malcolm, cloak whipping, Lady Isabel bound beside him, and the stolen banner clenched in his hand. Stay where you are, Malcolm called. Another step, and the widow joins her husband sooner than expected. She's no widow yet, Finn said. Nor will she be by your doing. Malcolm laughed, the sound brittle as glass. Do you still believe mercy is a weapon worth keeping sharp? You should have left me to die when you had the chance. I did, Finn answered, advancing a pace. And you lived. Don't waste the gift twice. Malcolm pressed the dagger to Isabel's throat. "Throw me the ledger," he hissed, "or her blood marks this bridge." Finn unbuckled the satchel, set it on the stones. "You'll have it, but you'll look at me, not her." He lifted his gaze, meeting those fevered eyes, and for a moment neither moved. Then Isabel stamped her heel on his boot. The blade slipped. Finn lunged. Steel flashed once in the moonlight. The two men grappled, feet sliding on wet stone. The roar of the river swallowed their breath. Malcolm's knife scraped along the parapet and flew into the dark. They hung together, locked, until the world shrank to the span of 2 hands and a heartbeat. Malcolm's boot slipped first. He clutched at Finn's arm, dangling above the abyss. "Hold!" Finn gasped. "I'll pull you up." Malcolm's face twisted, not in fear, but in some dreadful satisfaction. "You'll forgive me," he said softly, and let go. The river took him with a single white flash and no cry. The banner followed, uncoiling into the torrent like blood into water. Finn dragged himself back to the bridge, trembling with effort. Lady Isabel fell to her knees beside him, her bonds half cut, her breath in shivers. For a long moment, neither spoke. The river filled the silence. At last she said, "You spared him twice." "That is more than justice would have asked, and less than peace required," Finn answered. "The laird's last breath." They carried the news home before dawn. Duncan listened without movement, then lifted his hand, a gesture of release. "You've ended what my silence began," he said quietly. "I buried truth once. You've dug it free. Remember which work felt cleaner." He reached for his son's shoulder, smiled with the tired gentleness of a man seeing his own rest ahead, and whispered, "Mercy, Finlay. Keep that word where others keep their sword." Before the next sunset, he was gone. No wailing marked it, only the low hum of a psalm and the slow tolling of the bell. The hills kept their promise. They carried his echo farther than grief could follow. The following spring, a new banner hung above Glenmoor, patched where the old one had burned, its stag less proud but more honest. The mill rose again, built of stone instead of timber, its wheel turning steady as a heartbeat. The sign above the door bore 4 words Finn had chosen himself: "Bread before banners." Installment 4, Peace and Legacy. Spring crept back to the Highlands shyly, as if uncertain it would be welcomed after so much loss. Snow retreated to the high corries, the rivers lost their anger and learned to sing again. Where the south mill had burned, scaffolds rose, their timbers pale against the blackened earth. The scent of mortar and wet pine replaced the smell of ash. Finn moved among the workers each morning, not as master, but as neighbour. He lifted stones, steadied ladders, fetched the lime. The men at first protested. No laird should stain his hands, but he only smiled. "Stone forgets who sets it if the wall stands straight," he said. They stopped arguing after that. Lady Isabel watched from the terrace, her shawl drawn close against the breeze. She had buried a husband, forgiven a brother-in-law, and found a son all within 1 cruel year. Now she seemed lighter, the lines of grief smoothed by purpose. At her side often stood Elspeth Fraser, the bookseller's daughter, her quick hands ink-smudged and restless. Together they had opened a tiny reading room in the old chapel loft, where children traced letters on slate while their mothers spun wool by the door. It smelled of wax and heather and hope. One afternoon Elspeth found Finn leaning on the mill's new doorway, watching the wheel take its first turn. Water flashed through the paddles like liquid light. "It's done," she said softly. "Almost," he replied. "We still need grain to test her." "You'll have it before nightfall," she promised, then added with a teasing smile, "though I think you built this less for flour than for faith." He looked at her, amusement and weariness mingling. "Perhaps both feed better than I thought." They shared a silence filled with the sound of the turning wheel. In that moment, Finn understood that peace is not the absence of memory but its domestication, teaching it to live quietly beside you. A new Glenmoor. The years unfolded like the slow unfurling of fern after frost. The crofters spoke more of seed than of feud. The smith's forge rang brighter. The river, once the witness of death, became the servant of life again. Where Malcolm's shadow had lingered, gardens grew. Thomas Drummond returned, poorer, humbled, repentant. Finn met him at the bridge where mercy had last been tested. "You were used," Finn said. "That's punishment enough. Come earn the rest of your living." So Thomas laboured at the mill, and in time the villagers forgot to point when he passed. Seamus grew older, but not slower. He kept the ledgers neat and the laughter dry. Whenever Finn hesitated over a decision, Seamus would mutter, "The numbers already know the truth, they're just shy about saying it." Finn would grin and find the answer. Mary and Ian visited each harvest. Mary's pride was fierce but private. She scolded the servants for letting dust gather on the windowsills and then cried in the kitchen when no one was looking. Finn knelt beside her, kissed her worn hands, and whispered, "Whatever name I carry, I'm still yours." Ian clasped his shoulder. "Aye," he said, "but next time send for us before the roof catches fire." The reading loft. In summer, the chapel loft filled with children. Elspeth taught them letters, and more importantly, stories, the kind that stretch the heart as well as the mind. Lady Isabel read aloud from psalms or from old Gaelic ballads. Sometimes Finn listened from the doorway, unseen, content simply to hear the mingled music of voices and turning pages. He thought often of his father's last words, "Keep mercy where others keep their sword." Perhaps this, he realised, was what mercy looked like when it learned to build instead of rescue. One evening, as the sun melted behind Ben Rue, he found Elspeth on the terrace sorting books. The sky was the colour of copper warmed in fire. He said quietly, "When I was a boy, I thought stories were for folk who had the leisure to listen. Now I think they're for those who've run out of excuses not to hope." She closed the book and smiled. "Then you'll do, Finlay MacLeod. You'll do very well. The banner and the bread." On the first anniversary of Duncan's passing, the clan gathered at the mill. Smoke from cottage chimneys made a soft veil across the valley. A new banner hung above the door, the Stag of Glenmoor, patched and mended, its colours subdued but steady. Beneath it, carved in plain Highland letters, were 4 words, "Bread before banners." When the wheel began to turn, a cheer rose that echoed off the hills. Children threw handfuls of grain into the air, laughing as the birds swooped to claim them. Lady Isabel's eyes shone. Seamus wiped his spectacles and blamed the smoke. Mary reached for Ian's hand, and even he forgot to hide his smile. Finn stepped forward, the silver brooch gleaming at his throat, the same brooch that had once been a mystery, now only a memory polished by time. He looked out across the faces, farmers, weavers, shepherds, servants, and saw in them the shape of everything worth keeping. "My father taught me," he said, voice carrying easily in the still air, "that a banner means nothing if the hands beneath it are empty. Today the wheel turns again. May it grind for every house that kept faith when faith was dear. May the bread it yields feed both hunger and heart, and may the name of Glenmoor stand for mercy, not might." The wind took the last word and tossed it skyward. Some swore it sounded like the old laird's laugh echoing from the hills. Legacy. As years passed, travellers came to the glen and left again, carrying stories, of the foundling who became laird, of the fire that could not consume what love had built, of the valley where mercy was wealth enough. In the quiet seasons, Finn walked the ramparts at dawn. From there he could see both the croft that had saved him and the castle that had claimed him. Between them lay the river, still swift, still strong, still reminding him that every current returns in time to the sea. Sometimes Elspeth joined him, her shawl fluttering like a small flag. They would watch the first light strike the repaired banner. Its cloth was worn now, its threads showing the careful hand that had mended it more than once. But it flew. Always it flew. Finn rested his hands on the cold stone and whispered the creed that had outlived fire and feud alike. Mercy, courage, restitution, bread. Below, the valley answered with the sound of the mill wheel turning, steady, eternal, content. And in that rhythm, Glenmoor endured. If you've enjoyed this story of love, redemption, and quiet courage, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll be the first to hear our next Regency romance on the Regency Gazette channel. Thank you for listening.